Bonjour, Kwekwe. Hello, everybody. My name is Leora Gansworth, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. We're going to just give everybody a few moments to get situated and join the webinar. And I do believe that we have a sort of suggested that Stephen is going to direct us on how we're going to open this session.
All right, thank you, Leora. Good morning, everybody. Stephen Nitah Sulie. Dans ce Nitah in Neheriaski. C'est niais et don't say, no sin recursi. The law nil, Halidasi. A sayelde la hitsia afile. So, my name is Stephen Nitah. I'm calling from my home territory in the Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. We asked Nutah today, the creator, to guide us in our discussions as we discuss relationships, the relationships that's needed today more than ever to collectively work for Mother Earth, for the nature that provides us life. In the work we do together, there is reconciliation required. Just like there's reconciliation required in the relationship we need to build and maintain with Mother Nature, with nature itself. So I asked the creator, Nutah, to guide us in our discussions today, to give us the guide and light so that the knowledge we share is useful and is able to be used by people that are logged on to this call and people that will be watching in subsequent days. In my language, Nutah means island, and Nu means island, and Sina means the creator. It is a recognition of the fact that Earth is an island in the sea of space. And this is exactly what we are talking about today, is how do we create a relationship amongst peoples to serve this island we call Mother Earth. I asked the creator in the name of Nitah, a historical significant person within our territory. Masi.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So I'd like to welcome everybody to today's dialogue on building ethical partnerships for Indigenous-led conservation. My name is Kristi Leora Gansworth, and I am a citizen of the Kitigan, Zibi, and Anishinaabe First Nation, and I have grown up and spent a lot of time in my father's territory, which is the Haudenosaunee peoples in and around New York State. So one of the reasons we wanted to bring this webinar together today is a key question that comes to the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership staff is, as a non-Indigenous person or organization, how can we support Indigenous-led conservation? And so in this session, we explore the question and others through stories and examples of ethical relationships and partnerships that have been built, strengthened, or renewed from a variety of contexts. It's very important that we understand the vastness of lands, waters, and territories of what is now known as Canada as of today, that we recognize the rich diversity of communities, cultures, and the relationships we have with traditional territories and homelands as first people of those territories and homelands. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach to building respectful, responsible, and reciprocal relationships. Each partnership is context-specific and depends on individual relationships as well as distinct community protocols, values, visions, and objectives. The Indigenous-led conservation movement is evolving, gaining more and more recognition and support, and that requires conservation practices to evolve as well. Today, the discussion is around ethical partnership, and that requires us to be in ethical space. Pakani Blackfoot elder Dr. Reg Crowshoe reminded that We need to start building from the foundation of two systems and understanding each other. Once we can build that foundation, the first thing we should start working toward is the concept of trust and respect. It is within ethical space where we can achieve mutual understanding and respect of different knowledge systems from our own and can create new knowledge together and form ethical relationships. So the first thing that we have on our agenda is just a little bit of time to have our speakers introduce themselves. And we'll start with Stephen and Kevin.
Thank you, Leora. My name is Stephen Nitah, as I indicated in my open remarks. I'm a member of the leadership circle of the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership. I have my badge. I've been part of the Indigenous circle of experts that produced the report We Rise Together after having dialogue and engagement with Indigenous peoples from across the country in 4 regional gatherings and 2 national gatherings. The CRP was created to support the implementation of the 48 recommendations that was made through that report on ways that Indigenous nations would want to see, and the relationships they would want to have with Crown governments and others as they use some of their territories to help Canada meet its international commitments under the Aichi Accord of protecting 17%. I think that migrated to Canada's commitment to 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. To get to 30%, Canada needs to protect a quantum of land roughly the size of Manitoba, over 250,000 square miles, not kilometers. The opportunity for Indigenous nations across the country to use some of their territories in building relationships in the spirit of reconciliation is in front of us. To take back control of some of our territories that is under Crown designations or private lands, one form or another, is before us. We are all place-based people as Indigenous peoples. We are very comfortable within our territories. We have generations of teachings that come from those territories. At the same time, there are organizations in this country that have been working towards conservation of protected areas in one form or another, many different NGOs, potential partners and allies for the Indigenous nations, for ourselves as we move forward. Building respectful, trusting relationships is one of the key factors in building the right type of initiatives and the right type of teams to achieve the goals. My own experience goes back to my people's initiative to protect the heart of our homeland here in the Northwest Territories. We've declared an Indigenous protected and conserved area before the term Indigenous protected and conserved area was born. We declared the heart of our homeland our protected area under our law in early 21st century, and to start building the relationships we needed to achieve that protection, the recognition of that protection. In doing so, build relationships with Crown governments to use their laws as well. There's different motivations to choose to partner with Crown governments. My people wanted to create a relationship with Crown governments for several reasons. One of the main reasons is because we do have a treaty with Canada that we made on July 25th, 1900. It was known as Treaty Number 8. We didn't agree to Treaty Number 8. We agreed to a treaty on July 25th, 1900, where we agreed to share the lands, the resources, the responsibility for the management of it, and to share in the benefits of it. To achieve that mandate, 119 years later, required relationships with NGOs, relationship with crown governments, relationship with banking institutions, financial wizards, etc., etc. The type of relationships required is what we'll be discussing today. There's different types of relationship from the get-go. For an example, there's different organizations through the process of creating an IPCA. That's been our experience, and I'll be talking about that as we move forward in our discussions. But ideally is to build that relationship right from the get-go, create an understanding with your partners, what your agendas are and what their agendas are, or reconcile, and get an understanding and an appreciation for what resources and skills your partners bring to the table. And when you, as the lead Indigenous nations, will be able to utilize those skills. That's one way of supporting Indigenous leadership, is by providing your skills, your resources, your contacts, and applying them in a way that is respectful of the Indigenous nations you're working with and their agendas. I'll leave it at that for now and pass it over to Kevin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Smith. I'm the National Manager of the Boreal Program for Ducks Unlimited Canada, coming to you today from Treaty 6 lands in Edmonton, Alberta. And I think, thank you, Steve. It's been a real pleasure, and one of the best parts of my job is working in partnership with Indigenous communities. I think very early on, as an environmental not-for-profit, we recognized the synergies and overlaps that we have with Indigenous peoples around respect for the land, relationship with the land, and a bunch of other aspects that we have built into our programs to work with Indigenous communities in partnership. And I think, we were asked to kind of share our experiences, and I was fortunate enough to travel to Litzelkay, the community where Steve is from, and to witness the signing of Tydenenene as a national park reserve, and in one of the first Indigenous protected conserved areas in Canada. And it was an incredible moment, and just the wealth of knowledge from the elders, the commitment, and I was particularly struck by the commitment from the Indigenous youth for, the chief and council and the community kind of voted for it, but the youth stepped up and said, hey, we understand that the future of Tydenenene is in our hands, and it's in good hands. And a lot of those youth have joined into the Guardians programs that are now very well run, the Nitah Rangers and Guardians, and they're doing an amazing job sharing that incredible, beautiful landscape with the world, and at the same time keeping it for future generations. And I think that speaks to just the how incredible that relationship is, and how much as Angos we have to learn from Indigenous peoples and the leadership that they're showing on a bunch of projects like the Indigenous protected and conserved areas, the Guardians programs, but also the land relationship planning that's going on. And I think as Engos, we can, there basically is no roadmap for these relationships. And we just have to be ready to learn from both the successes, but also the missteps, and be clear, honest, transparent, and respectful, and to be flexible with a number of different situations that may arise. And we recognize as Ducks Unlimited Canada, we are far from perfect, yet we're committed to engage in partnership with Indigenous communities to advance collective goals, but really to support the Indigenous leadership that's happening. And I think the one lesson that we've learned is that it's not something where you can come in, do a project, and then leave. Once you establish that relationship, you need to be in it for the long haul, to support, to listen to the community and figure out what the needs are, and then continue to work through as the years progress, to work through those needs and working as a true partner with Indigenous peoples. And I think the other key aspect is as an organization and a non-Indigenous-led organization, to always challenge with internally, to be better partners with Indigenous peoples, that, make it a priority. Keep in mind that, sometimes speaking out is really hard, and it's society has different ideas and pressures, but the incredible leadership that Indigenous peoples are showing across the country is something to support, and something all of the Engos are increasingly and stepping up to support Indigenous leadership. So, and we also, look to amplify the incredible Indigenous voices, knowledge, perspectives based on the stories that we hear when we travel to the communities and sit down and listen, and understand that those are the real priorities, not the priorities that we have within our organization at some level, that it's the priorities that the communities have, and in supporting those, we better all of the priorities of everyone. And it's just, I think we just want to emphasize the importance of the relationship component and staying through the long haul. It's been a real pleasure to work with Steve and Indigenous peoples across the northern part of Canada, and but we're always seeking to learn and grow and keep the good work going. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to both Stephen and Kevin for those introductions and all the sharing that you've offered thus far. We're going to move to our next group, which is Kerri, Chad, and Richard. So Kerri, if you'd like to start with an introduction.
I'm going to let Chad start, actually.
Okay.
Thank you, Kerri. I don't mind that at all. Kisokyokit, Hosokot Kokone, Nelson Nifki, Amen Kakin Ditkat, Ukaki Kake, Yakan Noke, Amakas Ktunaxa. Hello, everybody. My name is Chad Luke, and I come from the territory of the Ktunaxa territory in the southeastern part of British Columbia. And I'm here to talk and share about our experiences with Katmuk, and how our journey has been, and where we are today and where we want to be tomorrow. And I'm really looking forward to sharing our story after our introductions. I'll pass that on to Richard.
Thanks, Chad. Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Klafki. I work with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, as Chad said, in southeastern British Columbia. I'm based in Invermere. My program area that my team and I steward conservation properties on actually really aligns very well with the background of Chad there, most of the Ktunaxa territory, and other nations nearby, adjacent as well. Yeah, and it's been a few years now that I've been involved working with Chad and Kerri on Cutbook, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now and elaborate more, and over to Kerri.
Thanks, Richard. Kizikukit, Kapinasketh, Hugaklet, Kerri Garner, Hukakikaki, Akiskakfiit. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kerri Garner, and I am calling you from the beautiful, snowy, cold Cranbrook, BC in Ktunaxa. So I have been working with the Ktunaxa for the last 8 years. And a lot of the work, a big part of the work that I'm currently doing is co-leading with Chad, the establishment of the Gutbook Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area. And it's funny to see Stephen here. I used to know him in the north. I've spent my entire professional career working for Indigenous governments. I used to work for the Klafki government in the Northwest Territories. And then I moved down here, ironically, on June 26, 2014, the day that the Silcoteen decision came down. I'm from Cranbrook. I left Cranbrook when I graduated and was never coming back. And that's the day I came home. And I didn't know that I was going to come work for the Ktunaxa Nation when I came home. And I ended up working here. It was all very meant to be. And when I came, it was just such a different place and space compared to where I was in the Northwest Territories, coming from a world of co-management, coming to BC. And I thought I had gone back in time 20 years. And since then, in the last 8 years since I have been working here, I have just seen such an incredible shift. There's obviously been a lot of political, legal changes in the last 8 years with the United Nations Declaration, Silcoteen, and many other different pieces that have happened. And you've just seen this really big shift towards really recognizing and embracing reconciliation with Indigenous people and with the land. And it's been an incredible 8 years. I've learned a lot. Again, I work for Indigenous government. I'm not Indigenous myself. And I am consistently working in this world of ethical space and trying to figure out how to move forward and how to really a big part of my job is to help create the relationships, I think, between the external and the Ktunaxa, and to help bring the Ktunaxa perspective along with Chad to the external, so that they're supporting what we need to do, not what they want. And it's been a really great experience working specifically with NCC. Again, I remember when I came here 8 years ago and where we were back then. And, you know, we were maybe a little bit more like this, not entirely like that. And we're just much more like this now. And I don't want to go into a lot of it right now because Richard and Chad will share a lot of it. But I guess, you know, just kind of some opening comments. I think my key message overall is creating relationships, and ethical relationships take time and space. And time is one of the key pieces. We as non-Indigenous people tend to have timelines and, you know, things that we need to get done and dates and blah, blah, blah. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been like, okay, that's got to go out the window. And it takes time to build relationships with people, to build trust, to build meaningful relationships, which are required to really do the really important reconciliation work that we need to do together. And it also takes time on the land and in real space, not this way. This is great. It's allowed all of us to be together today, which is wonderful. But Richard has been out on the land with us quite a bit in the last little while. We spent a bunch of days in the summer, and that just completely helps to build that relationship. And so those are just sort of some of the really key messages that I have for people is it takes time, throw your timelines out the window, and it takes genuine intent to build relationship, not for your specific intentions, but to really support Indigenous governments to push forward their governance and their agendas and their needs and what they want to see for their future generations. That's what I have to say right now. Tacha.
Thank you very much. And now we move to Willard and Nicholas.
Go ahead, Nick.
You're on mute, Nick. You're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. Hi, Willard. My name is Nicholas Scapillati. I'm the executive director of the Grizzly Bear Foundation, formerly of the David Suzuki Foundation. And I'll be talking a little bit about that today and our work with Musqueam Nation and Willard. I'm calling from Pender Harbor, British Columbia, in the Swia, which is the world birthplace and territory of the Seychelles people. And part of what we're talking about today is conservation and building ethical partnerships. And a big part of that is recognizing language and culture. And I'm happy to announce that recently Pender Harbor has returned to its traditional name, which is Callipin, to the great work of the Seychelles people. I've been working with Indigenous communities for over 25 years, and it all started with Willard Sparrow. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today and those relationships. And it's carried throughout my career what I learned working with the Musqueam community and how special and important that was, as I was only 26 years old when I started that. And I think that some of the things to reflect that the other panelists have said today is that, building partnerships is about listening. And I listen in a, Western way and a settler mentality, if you will, in that way. And I learned the different culture and way that Willard spoke. And I had to really learn to listen. And I thought it was different, the way that Willard spoke. And I didn't really understand that until I was honored to be involved in the Longhouse. And then I saw how Musqueam community spoke in that way, in that place. And then I understood how the culture, how Willard expressed himself. And so that was a big part of me, was shifting the way I learned to listen and understand different communication styles. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. In those days, which was, mid 90s, this was still very new for the David Suzuki Foundation. It was, before the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement. David himself had only been working with Indigenous communities for about 15 years. And at that time, we were working through science and Indigenous knowledge, and that was a core piece. And really, I'm still seeing organizations understand and make that change to their mission and things like that even today. And I think that was key to that relationship, was starting even back then with that understanding. And to reflect something that Kevin said, was this long-term commitment. I might be working at the Grizzly Bear Foundation today, but I have roots and connections to the Musqueam community that I made on that day, that it wasn't just a project, but it was a lifelong commitment to that community, that place, that land, not only because of its biodiversity, but its importance and sacredness to the Musqueam people, which is a great honor for me. And I think that that's one of the best things I've ever learned, is that you never really leave conservation. And when you're working in this way, you're making a long-term commitment to those people who've let you in to work together on something so special and so important. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Willard Sparrow. I'm calling you from the Musqueam Indian Band here in Vancouver. And I was fortunate enough to do the works of my grandfather and of my uncles prior to me, which I carry on. And the works that I do is conserve and protect Vancouver's last wild system here of salmon. And I was fortunate enough to work with Nick back in the days when we were younger. And working with Nick was something that was really easy to do, because we're actually able to walk shoulder to shoulder. And I think taking it from that point of view, walking shoulder to shoulder, there was no leader. So there was actually, we all had to be responsible for all of our actions. So good or bad, we both had to be responsible for those actions. And so we just continue on that mentality today. And that's basically how we operate. It's a simple mentality, but it takes on a lot of work, and it takes on a lot of responsibility. Working in the Metro Vancouver area, you can imagine dealing with 21 municipalities and trying to get this information across. And with the help of Nick, we're able to get that through by walking shoulder to shoulder. So.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's really good to hear just a little bit of a preview of some of the stories that we're going to hear over the next hour or so. So our key question here is, how can non-Indigenous organizations and people support Indigenous-led conservation? And so again, recognizing that there is no prescription for doing so, we're really eager to hear from each group about how they respond to that question. And we'll go in the same order, starting with Stephen and Kevin.
Thank you again. The report We Rise Together was built on years and years of Indigenous leadership, right from fighting for their rights before the 1982 Constitution to even today, where we're blocking pipelines and putting our health and safety and freedom on the line. That type of action is reflective of the deep understanding of the knowledge that we don't own land, land owns us. And what we do to land is what we do to ourselves as peoples. The world is recognizing that now. The scientifically proven that Indigenous peoples have relationship with 35% of the world's landmass, and that 35% is the healthiest lands in the world. And today, where we see the impacts of colonialism on everybody now through climate change, there's a direct connection to colonialism and climate change. What that era history did was treat the lands as they treated Indigenous peoples, with total disrespect, total control for economic gains. And today we are out of balance. Nature is out of balance. There's not enough nature to maintain the type of weather that we've experienced for hundreds of years. So how do we support those peoples, Indigenous peoples of the world, to not only maintain what we have, but to support us as leaders in this field of how to create and maintain a healthy reciprocal relationship with the lands and waters throughout the world. Here in Canada is how do we do it here today? In Canada, we are somewhat lucky in that we are in a time in history where there's confluences happening. There's a confluence of reconciliation. There's a confluence of a commitment to a target of protecting so much land. There's a resurgence of Indigenous pride, leadership, and responsibility. So how do we support that responsibility? How do NGOs and Crown governments support that responsibility? Today, we know there's over 80 Indigenous protected and conserved areas been declared by Indigenous nations. That's a hell of a lot of work ahead of for everybody. And the goal for the Conservation through Reconciliation is to help coordinate that work going forward. In creating the right space, Elder Reg Croshu introduced the concept of ethical space. where we can bring two different knowledge systems into a space without having to worry about one doing damage to the other. A respectful place where you can collaborate on the knowledges that work for both and respect the knowledge that doesn't work for both. And how do you move forward with areas that you come to agreement with? And if you're able to achieve that shared knowledge, you create new knowledge. And I think that's the gift for future generations, that two-eyed seeing knowledge systems, where we take the best of Western science and knowledge systems and combine it with the best of Indigenous world knowledge systems defined by worldviews, and how to maintain that relationship going forward. And I was just in California last week at a global conference, and I was sharing a stage with scientists, and questions to the scientists: how does science help us with climate change? I made the observation that science, Western science, helped contribute to the climate change. Western science, in all its forms, whether it's biological, engineering, or whatever other scientific designations that people get after studying for a period of time and become the experts. Those experts and their opinions have been used to justify colonial initiatives that destroy nature. So there is a need for Western science to adopt a different worldview, to be informed by questions that are generated from a different worldview than that of Western worlds and their worldviews. That questions and answers can be created within ethical space. So the questions we ask ourselves, or the scientists ask ourselves in the creation and management of protected and conserved areas that are led by Indigenous peoples, can be informed by Indigenous science, Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous knowledge systems. The science is as good as the questions that's asked. And I think the opportunity globally now is for Indigenous peoples to use their worldviews and the knowledge that has gained over generations to start informing the type of questions that should be asked, not only in our collective fight against climate change, but in our continued relationship with Mother Earth. So that's where I think it's important that we in the conservation community in Canada can create respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples to support their leadership, to elevate their rights and responsibilities within their territories, to help not only meet Canada's commitments of getting to 30%, but to help, if we can, to inform what Canada has done globally. Because as Indigenous peoples, we do sit in the forefront. Indigenous peoples of Canada, I mean, we do sit in the forefront, where we do have constitutional relationship with the Crown governments. And the reconciliation agenda is coming to fruition in many areas of relationship. And we could use these relationships to support these relationships as examples to support Indigenous peoples from different parts of the world that may not have the type of constitutional relationship that we can see a more respectful relationship with Mother Earth. The role of NGOs in building these relationships with Indigenous peoples should consider these should know where they stand and where they fit into this confluence of agendas in Canada. And once they do build relationship with Indigenous nations to support their initiatives of creating their own protected or conserved areas within their territories, to sit down with them, to understand their territories, to understand them, to understand their value systems, and also provide the information that you have, that they need. What can you bring to the table? What does your resources, your skill sets are, and how can that be used to advance the agenda of advancing an IPCA within Canada? My goal as a member of the leadership circle for the Conservation through Reconciliation is to start having gatherings of all the nations that are advancing IPCAs and all the partners of the CRP, well over 200 partners. All the major NGOs are partners in the CRP. And my goal is to get them all in the room, see what's needed by the different nations that are advancing IPCAs, and see what we can do to match the resources that the NGOs have, and the different academic institutions, and also those Indigenous nations that have made significant progress in the development and creation of their IPCAs to become resource peoples to support the initiative of getting to 30% and beyond. But most importantly, what that 30% represents being a different type of relationship with land. How can our knowledge systems, how can we take our knowledge systems and scale it so that it's not just ours anymore, that the global dominant populations are also taking ownership of this worldview, of this understanding that what we do to nature, we do to ourselves, and that we need nature to be able to survive and flourish on Earth. That's where ethical space can lead us. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I think we have an incredible opportunity right now to support Indigenous leadership, like the words that Steve just said, which are critically important right now. The globe is meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh and soon to be Montreal, talking about all of the climate and biodiversity crises that are happening across the globe. And the opportunity that we have now is to, like Steve said, elevate and raise that perspective and worldview and the stewardship and leadership. Who's been caring for these lands for millennia, generations and generations of Indigenous peoples that have lived on the land, had cultural and spiritual relationships with the land. And like Steve said, I think we've forgotten that. And the opportunity that we have is to work within an ethical space, sit down with communities, figure out ways that we can work together, but for NGOs to support Indigenous leadership as they go through all of these Indigenous protected conserved areas, guardians programs, land relationship planning, all of those types of things. There's an incredible opportunity right now. And a lot of 80 Indigenous communities have put forth IPCAs, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make that happen. Where's the funding going to come from for those beyond the initial establishment funding that's being provided? What are some creative ways that we can link in like Steve said, some of those, the rest of the world to help pay for all of the good work that communities, Indigenous communities are doing. And I think there's some very creative and innovative ways that have been developed through this partnership, the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, and other ones that we as NGOs can support and really help to advance the needs of the community, but only if we sit down and listen and are respectful and do it within two-eyed seeing in an ethical space where we're bringing forth the information that we might have as NGOs, but it can't be in isolation, like Steve said, with just the kind of Western science. There's so much Indigenous knowledge and perspectives that are critically important to braid with all of the other ways of knowing, so that when decisions come up, they can be informed and that the communities can be supported in that process. And I think there's a lot of ways through creative conservation financing, through a number of different avenues that NGOs can work together in partnership collaboratively, working with governments, you know, to figure out how we can support Indigenous needs of communities around IPCA's guardians and those types of things. So there's never been a greater opportunity, I don't think, than right now, and we just need, I think, to work together and support each other and keep going on this process.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Kevin. A lot to digest there, a lot to think about, and a lot to consider. And we'll hear next from Chad, Kerri, and Richard. And the question, however you'd like to answer it, is again, how can non-Indigenous organizations / people support Indigenous-led conservation? So however you'd like to tackle that one, Chad. We'll go to you first.
Thank you. Geez, how to tackle that, and how, well, for one, building trust is the biggest thing, because in working with Richard Klafki and the NCC, we actually had a bit of a rocky start, to be honest. And the biggest thing that I think we had to jump over a couple hurdles, because for not with NCC, but with other groups, with the other NGOs, and sometimes I always like to look at the past to acknowledge the past. You know, I don't consider myself very old, but I consider myself old. Kind of hard to say, but you got this word in here, reconciliation. Okay, so we gotta recognize the past, the way we were dealt with in the past. You know, it's hard for Indigenous people to understand that we got to start trusting somebody, and where are we going to start trusting somebody, especially with groups that are similar to non-governmental organizations. And, you know, because before it was, well, an organization would come to you, and then you would get the support, and then for them it would be you're in their back pocket. You know, there was a time where it was like that, and then all of a sudden we get more educated as Indigenous people. We get more smarter. We get more methodical in our thinking, and we said, "Whoa, time out. Where's our values within what you're doing, and you're getting our support? Where's our values?" So I like to look at the past And those things need to be acknowledged of the way we were treated in the past. In order to work today, today, and have a better relationship today, because we all want a better future for our people, no matter what. And I tell people that today, the work I do today is not going to benefit me one bit soever. I got to look at what we call the 7 generations down the road. That's the work I'm doing it for. How am I going to be able to sleep at night if I feel I'm not doing what's right? Because that's what's instilled within our people, Indigenous people, whether what nation you're from. Those values are instilled in our people across Ktunaxa and across Turtle Island, what is also known as North America. We all have those values. And so with the rocky start that we had with NCC, it was like, well, this is what we're going to do. It's our money. We got it. This is what we're going to do. And then I was just like, no, sorry. You got to instill our values. And what it did is it came to us to say, well, I don't understand who you are, not to be sarcastic or anything, but apparently we're indigenous creatures or whatever, something like that. But anyhow, the thing is, well, believe it or not, environmental people and a lot of people that are non-Indigenous have a hard time understanding who we are since time immemorial. They've always feared Indigenous people because they don't know what we're about, what we stand for. So we took it upon ourselves to educate and let people like the non-environmental government groups understand who we are as Ktunaxa people, as a nation, that we have creation story. And it goes back to what Steve was saying earlier, if the land isn't healthy, then I'm not healthy. I got to ensure that land is healthy in order for me to be healthy, because our job is to be stewards of the land. And that's just it, is we had to understand what stewardship meant, and that my way of thinking what stewardship meant and the way of NCCs and them, they need to work. They can't be oil and water. They need to work together. And it's building that relationship. And it's us letting us out and saying, well, this is what we're about. This is who we are. This is why it's important to us. Because sometimes those environmental groups want to have one more important than the other. Well, that's not going to get there if this isn't there. They need to be. It's just a matter of which one are we going to help first and foremost. And right now we're struggling. We're struggling on the land. Kootenai Lake is in my backyard. They're struggling with fish numbers and the different types of fish. Why? Because they want to help all of them, but it's hard. And so anyhow, working with people and doing these things, it's building that relationship, and it's getting to understand that I'm not right and they're not right. They're not right and I'm not right. It's a collaboration. Something that I've learned from a young age. My dad always told me, they're going nowhere fast and we aren't either. And the best thing to do is get along and make it work. And believe it or not, that's a reality. And if we can have allies like that to help and to educate why our land and territories are so important to our people. Because it goes right with our creation story, because each nation has a creation story. And believe it or not, you can read ours, a brief one, at Ktunaxa.org. And that's who we are as Ktunaxa people. And that's why building these relationships and working on specific areas such as Gatmuk with an IPCA is important to us. You know, it's been a long battle. Believe it or not, 30 plus years battling for an area, telling a developer to take a hike and take his 2 skis elsewhere. Him and his investors, and you know, I get emotional because there have been numerous elders that have passed on and have gone to the next life through this battle. And it would be really good for them to be here today, but they're not. You know, it's things like that that we as Indigenous people take in and hold on to, and why it's so important. Family is family. And non-Indigenous people have a hard time understanding that. And, you know, I've been reaching out to my coworkers continuously and letting them know that, you know, if I don't educate my coworkers such as Kerri here and helping her understand who we are, then I'm not doing my job either. And she's not going to be able to do the job for my people either. And that's just it. Is we have to educate. We have to, you know, it's pounding away. But letting them know who we are as Ktunaxa people and why it's so important is what helps build the relationship. So what I'm saying is you got to let some of yourself out in order for them to understand. And if they don't understand, then you got to tell them some more. It takes more than 1 or 2 or 3 times. It's no different than raising your children. You got to tell them 1, 2, 3, 4 times that they can't do that or they can do that. But that's it for me right now. Hey, Kerri or Richard, whoever wants to go up next.
Go ahead, Richard.
Sure, I can go. Yeah, as Chad alluded to, I started with the Nature Conservancy of Canada about 8 years ago, and was hired on as a stewardship coordinator. And, you know, we have these nice conservation area properties, and we do a restoration project and would like let the Ktunaxa know, hey, we're going to do some forest thinning or something. And they're like, well, that's an interesting, like, you're coming to us now. And you know, at the time you think, well, yeah, why wouldn't you like what we're doing? Like we're doing mutual beneficial things. And, you know, I think that's where some of that rub was, is that, you know, we've done all this Western science, we know what we're doing for restoration. And slowly over the years, people like Chad, like you said, educating and learning about the Ktunaxa way and cultures. You know, about 5 years ago, also the shift towards more Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, that the Nature Conservancy of Canada put out an Indigenous framework. And a lot of it is how might we support Indigenous-led conservation? How can we help? You know, can we be invited in to assist with our technical skills? Because we've done a lot of large conservation projects across Canada over the decades. And so also locally, my former predecessor, Nancy Newhouse, was invited by the Ktunaxa to a ceremony. And Chad said, since that ceremony, you know, she had a shift in her way of thinking, and just the relationship was improving then. And so over the last few years, just helping out, you know, NCC helped with the Challenge Fund and assisted with the kind of the neutral party for extinguishing the recreation tenure and assisting where we could. And where I come more in is to continue on with the support for like the baseline inventory and doing the Western sort of inventory of it and saying, okay, here's the skeleton of the work that we found. Now, how can we keep working together to have the Ktunaxa people have their input and make the IPCA their own? You know, that now it's the nation working with the government to establish this IPCA. And yeah, it's come a long ways in those 8 years. And you know, the first meetings when I was setting up the baseline inventory, say, okay, where, what are we doing? Where is it exactly? And they're like, whoa, you know, it's like lines on a map or not. That's a Western way of thinking, and it's area based. And I'm, you know, still learning these things and making mistakes and along the way. But Chad said, hey, don't be afraid of saying something stupid or wrong, because I'll tell you. And so that building up, you know, mutual respect and beneficial relationships, it's just the trust has become more and more evolved, and I feel a lot more comfortable working with anyone in the Ktunaxa about any of the conservation initiatives that, you know, our priority is not their priority, and I'm learning that still too. So it's like, hey, you know, coming to them first and saying what's your priorities is really important. And I think, yeah, we got a long ways to go, and it's been great being out on the land with the Ktunaxa and I'm learning lots from them about their views of what conservation is, because yeah, maybe our Western science way of thinking, this is what our restoration of a conservation property looks like. Now it's that larger picture, much larger conservation initiatives. As Stephen said, it's got to be what is it, 30% by 2030. So we're not going to get there doing, you know, small projects independently. So I think working across Canada on mutual beneficial goals and supporting conservation initiatives led by Indigenous groups and communities is a good thing. And I think we're going to keep that path forward and get there slowly. It's as Chad said, it's patience. It took him 30 years to sort of get that catmucks, you know, the tenure extinguished, and it's going to take a few more years to get an IPCA, their vision really on the land in place. So, yeah. Kerri, do you have anything you want to add?
Gosh, I'm not sure. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I guess just listening to everybody, I'm thinking a bit about, you know, we're talking about ethical relationships and how ENGOs or partner organizations can support Indigenous conservation. There's the organization, and then there's the people. And, you know, as I'm listening to you, I'm in our case with NCC, you know, a big part of it is it's because of the relationship that we have with the people that we have a relationship ultimately with the organization. And which I'm going to go back to what I said at the start, is it takes time, and it takes time and effort and space to be able to create those relationships. And that has to happen both in person, and it has to come from a really genuine and true place. It needs to, there's so much mistrust that's been built over the years in the history of conservation and preservation in Canada, that there's a lot of bad, I don't want to say bad blood, but there is a lot of bad taste in people's mouths about that. And it really takes time and effort to really to get over that, and to realize that people have truly genuine intents and really want to support Indigenous governance and Indigenous nations' interests, and not necessarily their own. Often they're combined and they're similar, but it needs to really, you know, it's been said numerous times so far, is it needs to be about supporting other organizations, supporting Indigenous governance to push these things forward. I think, and it's been said as well, it's really about building that long-term relationship, and really opening your mind and your heart to seeing things in a different way. And I think Chad said it, is that takes time. I cannot tell you, I'm telling this maybe a bit more from my own personal experience of working with the Ktunaxa and the Klitsho. I can't tell you how many times Chad or knowledge holders or Ktunaxa have told me something, and I'm like, yeah, I hear you, yeah. And then one day I'll be talking to them, and I'll be like, and they can see me do that, and they see that it goes from my head to my Grizzly, and I actually understand it from a completely different perspective. And Chad has seen that cocktail many times over the last 8 years. And yeah, and I think it's just, it takes effort on our own sides as a non-Indigenous person to like really be proactive and really listen and be open to that listening. And it takes a lot of patience on Indigenous people's sides to be able to and willing to put up with sometimes the fact that we don't hear things the first time that we're told them. And Nicholas, you definitely spoke about this and how much your perspective has changed over time, right? And that just takes time. I can't emphasize that enough. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in one meeting. It doesn't happen in a Zoom call. It happens over time. And having the opportunity to really explore ethical space and be in ethical space. And also I've heard the term brave space from people before. And I think as non-Indigenous people, we need to have that base relationship so that we can ask those questions and really try to understand and not be smacked, and to be there with somebody who's open and willing to help us to truly understand. And that's definitely, that's Chad and my strength. The two of us together are really able to, more heads are better than one is really what it comes down to. And I guess, thinking about just different ENGOs and different partners and different foundations that are out there. We've worked with a whole bunch of different ones to achieve what we've achieved so far, and we will continue to work with them. But we've always been really clear that it's about what we are doing. And if you want to work with us on that and support us, great. If you have your own needs and interests, we don't need your money. We don't need your skills. We don't need your support. We'll figure it out our own way. We got this. We're going to make it happen. So I think other organizations need to understand that, again, it comes down to, I think it's really that personal relationship and recognizing that Indigenous nations are all incredibly busy and there are so many people knocking on our doors. So if you want to get in the door, you've got to start to build that genuine intention and relationship with people. All communities and all nations are different. They all work differently. They all function differently. They're all built differently. There's definitely a lot of key foundational pieces that exist. But yeah, there's no cookie cutter answer. There's no one answer to this. None of us know exactly what the answer is. We're all building it and making it up as we go. And I think that the most important thing is being in a space where we're okay to we have that foundation so that if we fall and, trip and have, situations where things maybe aren't 100% perfect, that we have that foundation that we can get up again and continue to work together and move forward with strength and collaboration and and just in a really positive way. I think it's about us all being vulnerable and open to recognize that we don't have all the answers and that we don't know everything, and to be vulnerable and open to learning new things and seeing things from a different way and working differently and challenging your organizations. I know that a lot of organizations have changed their strategic plans and that are very much more reconciliation focused and working with Indigenous people, but there's still a lot of history there. And so it comes back to the individual people in those organizations who need to really challenge that and push that and say, no, we're not doing it the way that it once was. We need to do it differently. We need to do it with Indigenous people at the front of it. And we need to just support them in the way that they need support. They know what they need. You don't have the answers. So I think, it's about, I guess that's really one of my big lessons learned over the last 15 years is it's the individuals in the organizations who have those moments and can go from here to here and who are able to help really make the meaningful change in a really positive and long-term way. Because that's the other key, is it can't only be founded on one individual, because when that individual is gone, then what happens? So it needs to sort of, I guess, thinking of you as all individuals, it comes from both places, right? As an individual, what's your role with nations, and then as an individual, what's your role within your organization to help other people see the world differently. And I know, and I've met a ton of people, I see a lot of names on the call that I've worked with over time, and I know there's so much good intention out there, and there's so many great people out there, and people just need to learn together and work together and build together and grow together and support Indigenous nations together to ultimately support conservation of Ktunaxa across Canada. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We now turn the floor over to.
Can I just add
Sure.
to that? So one of the things is to help with the question and working together is, are they here to talk at me, to me, or with me? As an Indigenous group, are they to talk here with me or to me or at me? And that's kind of like the ultimate guide, I guess. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, to me, at me, or with me. That's a really salient question. The floor now goes to Willard and Nicholas. And again, however you want to respond to that question of how non-Indigenous orgs and people can support Indigenous-led conservation.
Sure. Well, I'll warm it up for Willard and provide a little bit of background. I'm just kind of, hearing what the other panelists have been talking about, that this work isn't easy. And I'll give you a little bit of background. The Musqueam Nation has accomplished some amazing things. Today we've heard about the Chilcotin case, and part of this work is getting people to look at these cases, understand them, understanding the work that went into them, the struggle that went into them. And there's two cases in particular that come from Musqueam, which was the Garner case in 1984, which established the government's duty to First Nations with regard to right and title, and that was hard fought by that community. And the second is the Sparrow case, which is, Willard will talk a little bit about that, and his uncle involved in that in 1990, and then is the government's infringement on Indigenous rights, and how is that justifiable? Those were hard fought, and it wasn't an easy climate back then. When I first met Willard, I think it's important for people to know that the struggles that nations have had. I heard this, I think it might have been on one of these series, but modern media movies talking about apocalypse and things like this. Well, Indigenous communities have, faced an apocalypse for 500 years, right? They're coming from a different perspective, and we're new to that. Even the term conservation is new. So understanding, that perspective. In the 90s in particular, when we were involved, the war in the woods in Klafki Sound was only, 5 or 6 years away. On the Fraser River, they were fighting. Indigenous fishermen and settler fishermen were fighting, and actually people were firing at one another, if you can believe this. And Willard will maybe tell you a little bit about that. And in the Great Bear Rainforest, the nations had asked major NGOs to leave their territory. This wasn't the climate that we're looking at today, where there's an openness to that. And there's a lot of that work has happened over the last 25 years to get to a place where we are today, but those bumps in the road will come later. And if we don't handle this in a respectful way, in an open way where we listen, or as Chad says, come and talk with me, those problems will come up again. We can't take what we've achieved for granted. And how we can support Indigenous leadership is having that understanding of that history, of the work that was done, the responsibility that community has, that's not just in that moment in time, but that stretches back thousands of years. And the approach that we took at that time was something based on the individuals who were leading our organization, David Suzuki, Jim Fulton, Tara Cullis, and the David Suzuki Foundation. And they had relationships with First Nations, but they were still learning a lot. And we made mistakes back then. But we'd done some work internally to, change the mission, to say that we work through that's what's now known in a beautiful way as the two-eyed seeing approach. So we'd made those changes internally. But it was a very challenging climate to build a partnership. And I think that's, I'll let Willard talk a little bit about that, about the, how can a partnership be built within a challenging, political climate?
Yeah, it's one of the thanks. Thank you, Nick. That's one of the things that we had to face was how we were going to move forward with a lot of the issues that we were facing during those days. And one of the ways that we did approach it, which has been proven to be very successful, is walking shoulder to shoulder with one another, and realizing that that we do have a past, but it's focusing on the future and where we want to be, and approaching it in a way where we can decompartmentalize and just genuinize history as it was being presented to us. So we actually walked forward in focusing on doing some conservation. However, conservation meant something very different to myself and something very different to Nicholas. But walking shoulder to shoulder, we were actually able to achieve our goals by explaining to our own groups, as you might say, of why we were working together and how we were going to achieve these goals. And so whenever time that we ran into an issue, Nick and I would actually get together and find out what the question really meant and what kind of answer we needed to provide. And the answer we had to provide was actually a dual voice. Both voices needed to be heard so that we can understand where we were coming from, where we're at, and where we're heading to. And by decompartmentalizing, we took the old First Nations approach to how we're going to deal with First Nations. We took that and took it as a approach on how we're going to approach a community. And by approaching a community, it's very, very diverse. So we didn't have a cookie cutter approach to this. And we actually had to listen to our elders on both sides to find out what really worked for you, what would you like to work, and what kind of things do we need to develop in the future, because we have no idea what the future is going to look like. But we know what the past looks like, and we don't want to go down that route. So essentially, that's what Nick and I are actually doing. We're always being challenged by the past, and unfortunately, we're still dealing with that today. So conservation means something different to a non-Indigenous person as it does to me. To our community, it involves a lot of the cultural practices, a lot of the belief practices, and we look at it in a 7 generations point of view, and we don't look at things at a program point of view. But we needed to mesh these two systems together, and by having that respectful relationship and understanding that we're not going to agree on everything, but we can come up with an answer that can be massaged throughout time.
Willard, hearing you talk about that, and actually hearing Chad talk about the elders that we've met along the way, and the elders that have passed, and the elders that brought this project to you, and I feel so fortunate that they shared that information with me. I think at the time, things looked pretty hopeless for what was happening politically, what was happening on the ground for the salmon, for your territory. And I hope that they saw hope in us, that there was that they didn't feel the hopelessness. And I think that I'm going to just share a photo to show, oh, it's disabled right now, but how young we were. And I think that it's important to recognize, as Kerri said, that there's limited capacity, that so much is coming to these nations for their time and groups wanting to work with them. And a lot of the time we're working with young individuals, people who were just trying to see which, can you see that photograph? So at Musqueam, they call them stream keepers and not guardians. But at that time, the community had put a lot of trust in a young group of people. And I think that that's one of the things that we can learn in supporting Indigenous leadership, is that the capacity of these communities that we work with, the challenges that they face, that often we're working with young people, and that has its own challenges, but also amazing opportunities. And I think that just as a little aside, small story is to talk about, we're talking about large scale, conservation and building partnerships and what that looks like with trust and listening. But sometimes it goes down into an individual little battle that you have to fight. And for example, when the David Suzuki Foundation started working with Willard and the Musqueam Nation, we had a lot of funding come in. And so to be a true and fair partner, we wanted to set up an account where both nations, or both partners, could access the funds. And it didn't seem like the David Suzuki Foundation was controlling all this money. We wanted to be open and clear. And we tried to set up a bank account with Van City, the country's largest credit union. They have a great reputation of supporting Indigenous communities now, but back in the 90s, they wouldn't allow Willard to open a bank account with a status card as identification. And we had to fight that battle that had nothing to do with conservation, nothing to do with what we were dealing with, to save, Vancouver's last wild salmon stream and build a relationship with the community. And we had to go and work with that institution to change that policy. So these things are going to come up along the way that aren't directly related to the work you're going to do, that the focus or the goals of the David Suzuki Foundation at the time. But it was our responsibility to follow through on those and support those and understand that this was happening. Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the history of colonialism, especially in Canada, of the assimilation policy. The assimilation policy was directed at Indigenous peoples, but it was applied to all Canadians. There's a reason why immigrants that are coming to Canada have no history with Canadian Indigenous peoples, have no opinions or whatever. Within 6 months of being in Canada, they have a very negative opinion of Indigenous peoples, because assimilation policy is right throughout the Canadian Canadianness, through all its legislation, policies, and regulations. And I think it's important to recognize and remember that. Even the term reconciliation, it's something that Indigenous people have picked up and are advancing, although it's not Indigenous people that need to do the reconciliation. We didn't do wrong here. The wrong was done to us. So the term reconciliation should be owned by the Canadian public and the Canadian governments. But as Indigenous peoples, we just left it, it would just go by the wayside. And by these initiatives is an olive branch by Indigenous peoples to the Canadian people and institutions. Come walk with us. Learn to reconcile with us. Even the conservation has a dark history. Conservation was used as a spear point of assimilation. Indigenous people were forcibly moved from their territories to create conservation or to take away land in the name of conservations, and some at gunpoint. So, you know, we're still using that language for the benefit of non-Indigenous peoples, so that there's words that you understand that you could use to start walking with us. I think I just wanted to share that because it's important that we can't forget about history and the role of conservation organizations in that history, and the need for those conservations institutions that played a role to do their own reconciliation as well. Thank you.
Yeah, an ongoing action.
You know, Stephen, I would thank you for that. And, you know, I mentioned about the Sparrow and Garner case and what that was like, and I'll let Willard chat a little bit about that. But just to finish my point is that, you know, an understanding is, you know, also reading books like Bob Joseph's book, you know, 21 things you might not know about the Indian Act, is understanding the history of the challenges that Indigenous people have faced in our country. I'll hand that over to you, Willard.
Well, there's definitely a challenge now for all Canadians to decolonize themselves. Well, that's part of the reconciliation process. It's not just rebuilding relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It's about how do we reconcile our own histories, our own attitudes. How do we deconstruct that assimilation policy that was applied to us? That's the questions Canadians need to ask, and Canadian organizations that had an official hand in implementing those policies. It's important for stepping forward in this walking together agenda.
And those policies are really program driven. And that's what really makes it a challenge for our established rights and our very well-being as Indigenous people. And it's getting out of this habit of programs, because that's been one of the Achilles heels of the Canadian program. And so we do really need to make that long-term commitment. We got to making it a sunrise sunset approach to these issues. They're ongoing. They're multi-generational, and they're going to be here for a very long time. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much to everyone. There's so many questions in the chat, and kind of just swirling in the air. I just want to acknowledge all the sharing and stories that you've offered thus far, which give us so much to think about. I'm going to try to grab some of the questions and direct them to individuals who've kind of spoken on some of the points that are raised in the questions, but just want to honor all that you've said, and thank you so much. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. And the first question is around knowledge systems. And so the question I'll direct to you, Willard, is how can Indigenous peoples who may have fractured relationships with knowledge systems due to colonialism defend and advocate for our knowledge systems as we reclaim them?
Wow, that's a challenge I face every day, being in an urban nation. It does require an individual to seek out the whole by contacting all of your elders in your community and gathering that information for them and sharing that information back. It's a long-term commitment because colonialization has minimized our sharing in that regards, and has minimized our knowledge base. And we just have to, in Musqueam's case, we have to continually make an extra effort at communicating with our elders, because through colonization, they're not so willing, not so open So you have to take it upon yourself to collect that information. It is there.
If I could add to that, Leora, when the Indigenous Circle of Experts Committee was working on the report We Rise Together, in defining what an Indigenous protected and conserved area, we kind of addressed that question. Indigenous protected and conserved areas are areas that are led by Indigenous peoples. We also recognize in that statement that not all Indigenous nations are in the position to be leaders because of the impacts of colonialism, and because of the impacts of the success of the assimilation policy. But what the elders had told us is that even though it's not in the forefront of their minds, given the opportunity, the knowledge that they have, the knowledge of the people is still within them, and it will come to the forefront, and they will eventually take a greater leadership role in managing their territories. So from that perspective, we recognize as a working committee that some Indigenous protected and conserved areas may be led by non-Indigenous peoples through respectful and ethical relationships, where the Indigenous nations are delegating others to advance their initiatives with them, and to take a greater leadership role. So that opportunity for leadership by supporters and allies is there, and it's been acknowledged and recognized within that report We Rise Together. The other observation I wanted to share from the work we did in engaging with Indigenous nations across the country was quite not surprising, but good. It was very good to hear. Usually a 2-day session, and the second half of the last day, an elder would always say, "Thank you. We've been waiting for young people to gather us like this, to move forward with this responsibility." You know, there's the one way we engaged the gatherings was that we talked about, you know, Indigenous people have been fighting for rights for so long that it was natural for a group of people that have been put together to fight for their rights right off the bat. So the first morning was us discussions around rights, and the second half of the first day we switched that discussion from rights to responsibilities, which was the core aim of assimilation, to take responsibility away from Indigenous peoples, not only to their territories, to their communities, to their families. So the reconciliation was required by Indigenous peoples to look at that $5 bill for those that have treaties. One side is rights and the other side is responsibilities, and we've been neglecting the responsibility for a long time. So, you know, the way I see the IPCAs and the initiative is Indigenous people reclaiming their responsibilities, and that's what the elders recognize in those gatherings. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. And I believe that there was a link placed in the chat. If not, Kristi or I will do that to link to that We Rise Together report, because there's a lot of information in there that people may not be aware of. So thank you very much, Willard and Stephen. Stephen, we're going to stick with you for the next question. And that question is there a good way for people trained in Western science to connect Indigenous worldviews and knowledge without being appropriative or speaking to a perspective that is not theirs?
Yes, that what they know is not the extent of that knowledge. That what they know, if shared with Indigenous, and they open their minds and hearts to the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, that knowledge that they have will be increased twofold. That in an ethical space, you could add a new knowledge, create a new knowledge. And I think that should be very exciting for academics and knowledge holders on both sides of the coin, or the $5 bill, if you will. Thank you.
Thanks so much. The next question is for Kevin. Understanding that time, effort, and space are needed to develop relationships with Indigenous communities, how do you reconcile that with the nature of funding? Often funds for these relationships have expiration dates and aren't guaranteed in the future.
Yeah, yeah, I will fully acknowledge that that is a challenge. But I think it speaks to, you know, when you're developing relationships with communities, you're also developing relationships with funders and governments, and over time, I think there's a broader understanding of timeframes and space and all of those types of things where you know, there has been a shift, for instance, within the funding world of funding directly for Indigenous-led organizations, and there's an opportunity, I think, to that's what I was talking about on the conservation financing side of finding more creative ways that don't necessarily have as many of the timelines and restrictions, but you know, can still have the metrics for success, but be grounded more in sort of in Indigenous perspective and opportunities where funding can be applied through Indigenous-led organizations to Indigenous communities. And I think there's a bunch of opportunities there, but it is definitely a challenge because all the funding organizations have their kind of agendas and needs, and you know, reporting to their boards and things like that. But I think that, you know, where success has been reached, it's when there are those foundational relationships where, you know, I think at times that's one of the support that NGOs can have for Indigenous communities is providing that support in terms of keeping that funding door open through the life of the project, and adjusting and being and standing up for, you know, when you're in discussions with the funders that, hey, we need to do a change order, or you know, the timelines are a little different than we had thought, but we're on a very good path, and these are the it's a bit changing the metrics of the way that what success in terms of the timelines looks like. And I think having that flexibility and awareness and understanding from the funding side is also really important.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Nicholas?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on, you know, what Kevin was saying, and this idea of like decolonizing giving, like like don't even get me started on a federal government application for funding. Like it's literally the worst. And some grant makers or financial institutions, there's more opportunity, I think, as you know, Kevin mentioned, to work directly with them to decolonize giving. I sat on the Van City Enviro Fund committee for 10 years and trying to bring my perspective to that. So there's some institutions that actually have open boards like Van City or like the Royal Bank of Canada, where you can go in and influence and talk about a perspective with giving. And with private funders, I think it's our responsibility when we get a grant. It shouldn't just be a one-way relationship where we're talking about, oh yeah, hey, thanks for the money, and we'll just do the work. I think it's a learning how to give, understanding the project, understanding the challenges, and helping break that colonial mentality with giving. And so I think that, you know, again, I mentioned, you know, there's responsibilities beyond the work on the ground, and that's another example is through funding, and you know, it's part of what we do, and it's another thing that we can do that can support Indigenous leadership in these areas and help our work. Thank you.
decolonize giving, I think there's a lot to unpack there, especially in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems and how Indigenous people view giving and receiving, all aspects of life and gifting and that whole process. So thank you very much for sharing that. I was going to go to Chad, but it looks like he might be off the screen for a moment. So are you there, Chad? Oh, okay. Yeah, the next question is to you. You spoke about trust earlier. So the question of trust is a value to deeply unpack. The question is kind of got multiple parts. So trust with whom? An individual or an institution? What happens when trust is broken by decisions made by the institution? How is the relationship held between individuals? So there's a lot there. Any of that you want to answer in the next few moments?
Thank you. Yeah. Trust, I think I can safely say that as Indigenous people and all of us that work in, say, our respected, say, communities / governments have learned how to read individuals that are there just to say, hi, how are you doing, blah, 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 and then they move on. Or else you have people. What it really comes down to is being able to read and understand, but also be able to pick up if they're lacking that want to know and they're trying to be, say, safe, and they're not sure because they don't want to make offensive gestures and or ask offensive questions, whereas knowing the difference between genuine versus fake individuals, I'll say. Richard has been very genuine with us. And he goes, I'm sorry, but I don't know how to ask this question. And if you have people that are like that say that they don't know how to ask a question, they genuinely mean they are genuinely interested, because they're saying, how do I ask this question without being offensive? And those generally you can have a good conversation because it takes time. It's no different than the time. It's no different than timelines. It's no different, just getting to know. It's, we're not going to be friends today. No, that's not how we work. No. And that's just it about. We got to build that trust. That trust needs to be built. It's not gonna happen overnight. Heck no. If you think it's gonna happen overnight, and that goes back to a Western Canadian society concept. That's a whole across the pond concept, getting along right now. No, no, that doesn't work in any Indigenous community. Believe it or not, humor is a big thing in our communities. If you don't get teased within the first 2 minutes, you're done. Nobody will not pay attention to you. And I'm being honest, humor is good. If you're being teased and you take offense to it right away, then that shows you got some walls that don't need to be there. And believe it or not, that's yeah, exactly right, Willard. And you need to relax, buddy, because if we didn't want you to leave now, I think you would have been put in the back room and locked up for a little bit. But anyhow, trust, humor. And there's things that Indigenous people do in order to make you feel invited. It's not all work, no play, because that doesn't work. And building the trust is, like I seen on the thing here, that there's a bit of some people are saying it's really good to see you guys being vulnerable to the crowd. And if I'm not being honest with you, then how am I going to feel good that I did a good day's work? I'm here for a reason. I feel I have something to share. But coming to build and trust is, you got to ask the right questions, and you got to be ready for what you're looking for. Because if they're not ready to acknowledge the past to work today, you'll never have a future. And that's the way I work. You know, I'm not asking you to carry what happened in the past. That's not yours, but acknowledge it. Acknowledge that it was wrong. Acknowledge that you screwed up. You know, I like that. I like that whole thing of moving forward, but let's move forward together. You know, we have to move forward together, because I don't see anybody moving anywhere pretty fast and moving to another. You know, people do move around. I give praise to my coworker Kerri. She has worked really hard on learning the Ktunaxa language, which is really hard to learn. And because it's one of 5 isolate, and the way she introduces herself. And for those of you that don't know, she said, "Hi, my name is Kerri, and I live in the community of Cranbrook, which is Akisqaklit." And anyhow, building that trust, and you know, acknowledging what territory you're in, you know. And anytime I go to Vancouver, I get scared. Not my territory. No, just kidding. But you know, if I were to ever go up north and see Stephen, man, I wouldn't know where to hide. But anyhow, because it's so open up there, right? But anyhow, you know, you gotta trust the hand that leads you. And we've been trying to lead as Indigenous people. We've been trying to lead since time immemorial. But believe it or not, non-natives have a hard time understanding that. And you know, that's how we've worked on building relationships. That's how, you know, when we say no as Ktunaxa people, I don't mean to babble on, but when we say no, we don't want to have to explain why. And because for the longest time during our Katmuk battle, we said no, 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 no. And then the government kept on poking and poking. You know what they say when don't poke the bear, but they did. You know, and anyhow, it's just, I shouldn't have to explain, because those are our spiritual. That's us. Those are you know, why should I have to explain to the government to who I am? Or who are they? Who are you? Who are you to be asking me those questions? What gives you that right to ask me those questions? What gives you the right to disrespect me? What gives you the right to think you rule over my territory? What gives you the right to think that you have some sort of power and or energy over us, when we have creation story of where we were born and how we got here? You know, it's remembering where we came from as Ktunaxa people. Those values need to stay. And that's what it's like with every other Indigenous community. Remember where you came from. Don't forget that, because once it's lost, it's lost. We still struggle today with gaining the knowledge that with whatever elders we have left. But anyhow, trust is built on us asking the right questions and watching how they react, because we've always known who our enemies were. But anyhow, Tacha, thank you. Hopefully I made sense.
Nicholas, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to build on something that Chad said. And, you know, in this time of reconciliation, I've had friends and colleagues, and they don't know what that means. They don't understand reconciliation. And sometimes they're like, I don't feel like I need to apologize for this. This is, you know, the history. I didn't do anything. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done there and understand the privilege that's been built on this history. But it's something that, you know, as a, working for a conservation organization as a settler like Kevin and Richard, there's this, I think one of the reasons we've been successful is that there's being a little bit humble when you enter these relationships, you know, and I was really Chad talking about Richard saying, I don't know how to answer this question. I don't know how to ask this question. When I stand in front of Indigenous communities or First Nations or gatherings, something that I learned from Musqueam and being in the Longhouse is that I stand up and I apologize is the first thing I do. I apologize for the mistakes that I may make, for the understanding that I don't have, and letting people know that I'm coming from that perspective. So I'm an understanding in advance of that I may stumble. And that's a big part of this work. And in some of the pre-sessions, we talked a little bit about that, is like recognizing that you will stumble, but don't feel that you're going to be pushed away or that you can't learn from that. And as Chad said, you're probably going to get teased for making mistakes. Don't take it personally. Be there and open and listen that you can stick with it. As you'll be tested by communities. You'll be tested to see if you're going to stick around. I've been torn down many times and I just sit there and listen. And at the end, they're like, hey, that was pretty good. You took that. Okay, let's move forward, right? So don't be afraid to make mistakes and to be criticized. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Unfortunately, just looking at the clock, we're just about at time, but to Nicholas, Kerri, Richard, Willard, Chad, Kevin, and Stephen, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think we could continue this conversation for potentially weeks on end and continue to learn from each other. We've only had a glimpse today, and you've all shared in such a beautiful and heartfelt way. And I know that that resonates in the minds and hearts of people near and far. So we turn to Stephen now to close us out in a good way. And thank you all for your presence today, whether you're watching live or later on. Hopefully this information is helpful to you. Stephen?
Thank you, Leora. As we close this discussion, let's recognize these types of discussions are just starting all over the country, and that how we learn from each other will be reflected in how we move forward together. And moving forward together, combining the best of both worlds. And in my part of the world, we call it walking in two worlds, and connecting them is going to be so important. As Elder Albert Marshall teaches, the greatest responsibility we have as individuals is to ensure that the next generations can benefit from the same territories that we benefit. That is the greatest responsibility as individuals, is to make sure that there's a tomorrow for the next generation. And I think in Canada, we are on our way to creating the type of relationships and knowledge systems that can be used globally to ensure that tomorrow is there for tomorrow's generation. For the energy that you bring to ensuring that, the care with which you enter into relationships and maintaining the relationships, I thank you on behalf of Nitah, the creator. Nitah is, in my language, Nitah is not God, is the creator of Earth, and they give us instructions through our teachings on how do we take care of our home base. That's why we refer to ourselves as place-based peoples. And it's important that those that are working with place-based peoples, that they understand and respect the history of the generations that inform the current generations they're working with. And where there's been a disruption of that transfer of knowledge, be patient, bring resources to that community with your resources, bring knowledge from others to awaken those that whose knowledge needs to be awoken. As the elders say, we may have lost our language, we may have lost our teachings, but they're not lost forever. It's there within our genes, within our brains. It's in the back. It's just not out front. It needs to be drawn out. As part of the reconciliation agenda, the more we draw out that knowledge, the quicker we get to two-eyed seeing. The bigger the ethical space becomes, and that should be the challenge we accept as individuals and as organizations. How do we expand that ethical space here in Canada and around the world, where the value systems and knowledge systems that Indigenous peoples in their place-based areas can share and escalate that worldview globally, so that when we do get to the 30% and beyond, and we lead the way to ensuring that nature provides part of that solutions to fight climate change, and hopefully the other 2/3 would be there to support what nature is providing. That going beyond that, we don't go back to the destruction of nature as part of the economies of the world, part of the quality of life that we that is in the forefront of many minds today, so that we continue living in balance with Mother Earth. That's the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity going forward. If we do well, then we're going to see billions of people on Earth, and it's going to tax the resources of Mother Nature. And if we continue using the same methodology to provide goods and services to the population of the world, then the world will not last much longer. So with that understanding that we're all collectively working in support of Indigenous leadership, in support of and recognition of Indigenous rights and responsibilities here in Canada, let's see what we can do here to also share with the world. Not only at COPs, but gatherings of Indigenous peoples should be something that we work towards as well. We're doing what we're doing here in Canada, but we need to create that momentum globally so that Indigenous people can share knowledge as well and validate knowledge. And that knowledge is shared through the ethical space with others. And so that we can collectively fulfill our responsibility to ensuring that there's a tomorrow, maybe a better tomorrow for tomorrow's generations. And with that, I say Masi Cho to Nutsine, to our Creator, and all our relations. Masi Cho for attending and asking the questions and being interested. Masi Masi.